So I made the point to you guys that prior to Socrates, especially when you start with Homer, there's no centered self, which is maybe one way I would translate the word soul, or to try to define the soul as far as what's meant by the soul. And the Homeric figure is at the mercy of a play of forces, and so therefore doesn't have what we would call a centered self. It's still a tough argument to make, and I got hung up, I have to admit, on the work of Bruno Snell that talks about how the major terms for consciousness are quasi-organs in Homer. So we related the mind to smelling, the psyche to breathing, the tumos, which is this center area, to the thymus gland, and phrenes, which is a word we haven't bothered much with, but it's used by Homer, to talk about a kind of region in the chest differentiated from tumos, which is associated with the liver. So it helps to get a sense of the character of oral society of Homer that is pre-literate and pre-rational in the sense of trying to grasp what a Homeric figure is like. So it's proto, it's before things have come into a focus, and that's a graduated evolution until you get to Socrates, where it comes into full focus. So Socrates is the culmination of the Greek adventure, the Greek quest, the Greek experience, which establishes the classical experience. And in a way we reenact it by virtue of becoming educated, where we're taken from our sort of field experience without a centered self, and we're educated to the point of coming into focus where we function as an autonomous self. So I wrote down some of the themes that we touched on, just to run through them quickly again. So we did the smile, the archaic smile, and the simile as characteristic of the Homeric epic period. You add an I to the smile and you get simile. I like that. And the similes, in a way, are expression of what they're smiling about, namely this reunification with the natural order and the forces of the natural order, so that in the simile you can compare things naturally, like Penelope's tears, to the melting streams. And so the similes are expressions of this archaic order where human beings are still resident within nature and are at one with the forces of nature. To me, that's what they're smiling about. It precedes the subject-object split that comes with rational self-consciousness and literacy, which occurs in the classical period, and especially with Socrates, Plato. So we talked about the rediscovery of Troy, how it was dug up by Schliemann, and how that was a major archaeological discovery, but because it proved that there was such a historical period, which at the time of Schliemann was thought to be simply poetry, that there was no historical reference, there were no heroes, there was no Homer. Well, there may have been a Homer, but anyhow, these were poems, and they had no historical reference. Schliemann undermined all that when he dug them up. And we talked some about the epic, which is what the Homeric poems are, and how they take place in the perfect tense. I love that term, and I don't know of any literature on it. You ought to Google perfect tense and add it to your log, just to see where you get with it. It's a tense of transcendence, past perfect, present perfect, future perfect. And the reason why it's the tense of epics is because it's accomplished action that is told as though it's happening for the first time. But it's all already happened. So it lifts it up into the perfect tense, past, present, perfect, future perfect. And it becomes characteristic of epics from Homer on. So you have the perfect tense with Virgil and with Dante and so on as the sequence of the great epics of the Western tradition. So I like the theme of the perfect tense because it's a tense of self-transcendence, given the fact that Homer has to pray to the muses for the words of the poem. They are not his words. He is the agent and the vehicle for the words that are the words of the muses, the daughters of memory. And that's where the words of the poem reside, and he prays to be elevated to them and that they give him the words of the poem that he then gives expression to. That's nice. And it makes the epic and the poems almost like prayer, where you have to elevate yourself beyond yourself in order to get the words that are given by these transcendent figures, namely the daughters of memory. We played up the theme of Achilles having to die and the prophecy that his mother reiterates to him repeatedly in the Iliad, and how this seems to, in a way, cripple him. I mean, he's looking for a way out. And so he picks a fight with Agamemnon in order to remove himself from the fighting, as if he has this chip on his shoulder, with the chip reading, "You're going to die at Troy." And you're the only figure that's been picked out to be told that explicitly. And so he tries to cheat his fate by removing himself from the fighting, and then has to go in to avenge the death of Patroclus and fulfill his fate. And for me, the greatest words of the poem are when he says to Hector, "Die, and I'll take my own death whenever the gods decree it." So he takes his death upon himself. And this sets up the theme that we'll now encounter in its fullest form with Socrates, who defines philosophy as having one foot in the grave. And it's a kind of ironic definition because I made clear to you that the term psyche or consciousness, breathing, in Homer, is the last gasp at the point of death. So you go from the last gasp in Homer to a kind of fully realized conceptualization of what philosophy means as far as meditating on having to die. That's amazing. And so, in a way, Achilles is a kind of proto-Socrates in his coping with this prophecy about his having to die. And then Socrates makes this the major theme of philosophy as far as meditating on one's mortality. And that's a major theme in the Platonic dialogues, which we'll spend some time with. So, I was much struck by Eric Vogelin's discussion of Homer as a diagnostician of disorder. I think that's a brilliant phrase. And how the disordered psyche of Achilles mirrors the disordered character of Troy and the Mycenaean War, the Trojan War, and the shakedown, breakdown, collapse of that society. The disorder of Achilles' soul, such that he has one, and the disorder in the political order and the collapse of Troy is something that Homer gives expression to. And in a way, it's picked up also by Plato because he wants you to see that the fate of Socrates and the fate of Athens and the relationship of one's own soul to the civic soul. I mean, Plato makes them interrelated. The social order has a soul just like the human being does, and they mirror one another. And so if the social order is completely disordered, you have a hard time with your own soul as far as ordering it. And Plato is so keen on the symbols of order versus disorder, and how Socrates is picked out by Athens to execute as a kind of major expression of the pathology of Athens at the time. The one man whose soul had an order to it and should have been the savior of Athens, and instead is the martyred victim of Athens. So you get this microcosm-macrocosm relationship, which we've also talked about as the self-world correlation. So you go from nature, self-nature, kind of proto-self-nature in Homer, where human beings are embedded in the natural order so that similes, comparing one thing with the other, are possible, to the differentiation of the self from the natural order in order to get to the self-world correlation. And this is a version of the micro-macrocosm theme that Plato makes so much of, in the sense of not only the social order, the political order, but also the cosmic order, mirroring the human order of the soul. So that the transcendental constitution of order in the soul becomes the central theme of the Platonic dialogues. So, and you know, that's what makes it move from tribe to civil. You know, it's like they come out of the woods into the city, and it's a move from oral to rational literate. I mean, these transitions are so constitutive of the Greek experience and so marvelous to trace. And the interlude from Homer to Socrates are the pre-Socratics. We did short shrift of them because we didn't have time, but we spent some time with Parmenides and the chariot ride to the vision of being, and Heraclitus and his concentration on the Logos as the rational structure of reality. And so now we come to Socrates. Now, does anybody want to ask anything about any of that sketch to pick up any of the themes to pursue a little bit today before we go on to Socrates?
What was the phrase you used again about disorder? I didn't hear the first word.
About what?
Disorder? The something of disorder?
Diagnosis.
The transcendental constitution of order in the soul?
What? No, the diagnosis of disorder.
Oh, the
Diagnosis of the disorder.
diagnostician of disorder.
Diagnostician of disorder.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Now, we made a little bit also of how Helen was the figure for that. Namely, you know, there are irrational forces at work that are going to bring down the social order of Troy, the political order of Troy. It's a collapse of that period of civilization that Homer looks back upon, separated from it by multiple generations, maybe 500 years. It depends on how you understand the transmission of the songs about Troy and where Homer comes in that process to put them together to form the Iliad and the Odyssey.
So could I might be reaching here, but are you saying that disorder is measured by or against, I guess, those who are trying to like defy it or stay ordered, who are resisting that disorder, the descent into disorder?
In Homer, it almost is as if it's so regnant, the forces are so insidious in the scheme of things that there's no resistance to it.
But I'm just saying, didn't you say Helen? Doesn't she still kind of keep the faith and stay sort of like a stalwart, like sort of strong against the growing disorder? Like
Yeah, but I only meant Helen in the sense that there's no rational reason why they didn't give her back. I mean, if she's the reason for a 9-year siege.
Oh, I wasn't thinking of Helen. Oh, shoot. Never mind. I was thinking of Penelope. Oh.
Oh, okay.
Okay, never mind.
See, that shifts the whole thing to, you know, the Odyssey.
Okay, interesting.
But it's fun to think of the two together. I mean, Penelope is the central figure of the Odyssey as far as, you know, fooling the suitors and keeping the thing going beyond all reasonable patience. And it finally provokes Telemachus to go on a chariot ride to see if there's any word about his father. 20 years later. I mean, the war has been over for 10 years, and he's 10 years after that, he's still not back. Where is he? So Penelope is a nice counterpart to Helen as far as keeping the show going and waiting with such patience for Odysseus to return. And we made so much of the moment when she's getting a kind of intuitive sense that he has reappeared, even though he's disguised as a beggar, and she doesn't know that's him. But here he is singing songs about Odysseus, and it makes her cry. And the simile is such that she begins to warm from her cold waiting and her frigid hardness, which is compared to mountains where the snow is now being blown over by spring winds, melt into spring streams, and so melted she. Him mourning as remote who sat beside her. And I'm sorry that I couldn't make more than I did out of the interpretation that I pushed on you by Rietzler, and why this single simile is so illustrative of her being. And all these strange phrases that he uses, we should have probably listed them out to indicate why the manifestation of her being in this simile is an anticipation of what Parmenides sees as the vision of being. So when he says is, you can think of what that meant in the simile about Penelope. It's her being that's given expression to. And Rietzler takes pains to indicate that it's something you can't say. It's this gestalt of features. It's a picture. It's configuration. And the similes configure the moment, the character, the issue of Penelope's being in that moment when she's next to her husband disguised as a beggar. And that to me, that was kind of, I've hung on to that essay for years as illustrative of something that is so hard to give anyone a sense for. And if you if you really get the sense of what Rietzler is saying and what's being expressed and what he called Homer's contribution to the meaning of truth, in a way that goes against, in some sense, the way we put down Homer as proto and primitive and anticipatory, precedent to take off from him to show how rational self-consciousness emerges almost at his expense, and how the culmination is for Plato to eliminate Homer from the Republic because they want to get away from the Homeric state of mind. What a dumb thing to do. I mean, the only way you can explain it is because they see that a whole new, what Havelock calls a mechanism of communication, a whole new basis for teaching and educating anybody has come into expression against the Homeric state of mind. You want to get people out of that trance state and all that. But, I just reviewed in my mind how strange it is that here you have Homer who makes it clear that to be a Homeric hero means you have to do feats of valor in battle such that you become the subject of everlasting song. That's the Homeric holdout for immortality. You're not forgotten. You're memorable. You overcome the anxiety of being forgotten, which is in a way the anxiety of non-being. And you're sung about forever after, and that's what every hero achieves. And then in the Odyssey, he has Odysseus encounter Achilles in the underworld. The dead Achilles calls out to him, "Old knife," which totally knocks me out, and wants him to say something reassuring to him because Odysseus is so shattered by the experience of meeting the dead, beginning with his mother that he didn't know had died. Achilles, say something reassuring to me because we honored you as a god when you were alive, and you were the greatest of all heroes, and you were the subject of Immortal Song. The dead Achilles says, "I'd rather be the slave to some poor farmer on iron rations, then lord over all these gibbering shades the after images of used up men. Now, if Homer isn't rashly self-conscious, how come he does that? How does he put this critical kick to what you otherwise take as the whole meaning of his enterprise, to sing the songs of heroes? I mean, it's such a funny self-critical check that, you know, you have to kind of overhaul what you said about his being, you know, prior to whatever. It's like in that moment he transcends my own appraisal of him, which I get from reading all this stuff. Get it?
What do you think that
Huh?
What do you think that did?
Well, I don't know, it makes me undergo a kind of critical check on my own, you know, notion of the primitivity of his language and the notion that there is no centered self or rational self-consciousness. They're at the mercy of a play of force. All that's true. And then you have this funny breakthrough where he gives this odd critical check to his own major thematic. Okay, so Homer transcends himself. Good for Homer.
Maybe he's saying you transcend yourself when you die.
Yeah, I mean, so take it at that. That, you know, and what a realistic message to be given by the likes of Achilles. Here he has struggled with his having to die throughout the course of his heroic life. And now in the underworld, he sticks it to you. You know, just, hey, listen to this. And in a way mirrors what Odysseus' mother says to him. He tries to embrace her, and she wafts through his fingers like smoke. The dead are pure past, and the only way they get any kind of presence to be able to converse with Odysseus is by virtue of drinking blood, which is sacrificed to them as they start to appear. And so as they drink the blood, they take on some semblance of a presence. And so he converses with his mother and realizes that she's died and so on. And then he kind of wants to beg off from it. And she goes, nah, this is, all mortals meet this judgment when they die.
So are you saying that by fearing that he's going to be forgotten, that's evidence that he had some rational self-thought taking
right.
place?
And it's one of the great anxieties. You know, think of it. I put it to you a little bit. Have you ever thought about the anxiety of being eternally forgotten? Like once you're dead. You know, most of us don't enter history such that we're remembered in that sense. We're dealing with figures here now that have made it into history and are remembered and discussed and taught and reflected on, and that will continue to be the case, I guess. But with most of us, that isn't going to happen, and so we'll be forgotten, like the mass of mankind prior to us. And what does it mean to you that you're going to be, if you take it up into eternity, and just forgotten by everybody that's alive, you're eternally forgotten. Which means you're really dead. Or dead.
And one of the things happening right now too is that books are disappearing.
Is what?
Books
Yeah.
are disappearing, and it's all in ether somewhere.
Well, that's okay.
So things can change.
I got my books.
Even
You
worse.
can't take that away from me. But it's right. I mean, here we are at the end of this tradition, and we resurrected it for Cowell, just to see what you guys are going to make of it. And it's probably not going to continue beyond this effort. And I feel a little bit like Rip Van Winkle, you know, coming back to tell you all. And there's this great line from Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, you know, which is in a way like this class, you know, to squeeze the universe into a ball and to roll it towards some overwhelming question. And she, settling her shawl, turns toward the window and says, that's not it at all. That's not what I meant at all. And then he said, no, I'm not Prince Helen. To be or not to be. You know? That's the question. I'm an attendant lord, and someone who will do to swell a scene or two. So you have Prufrock begging off himself from asking anything ultimate because of the shrug. So, you know, it's hard to say what to make of this tradition and the spiritual substance that it entails that's been transmitted from one generation to the next up until now, and whether we really witness a short circuit in the tradition that won't be overcome, because we're all entering into this whole new era where books are going to be passé. So just what literacy meant to the Greeks, it's now come to its fulfillment. I mean, we've gone through a 2,500-year period of book culture. This was the kind of basis of rational self-consciousness. They go hand in hand, and they were arrived at coincidentally. And Plato's dialogues are one of the greatest expressions of rational literacy. And his books became the foundation for teaching and education in the Western world. Well, now we're seeing that coming to an end. And the transition to a whole new technology, just as the Greeks experienced the new technology of literacy and rationality, if you want to call it a technology. It's not a bad term. And it's on the basis of this technology and its appearance that it shifted everything. And Socrates is regarded as the figure who embodies this shift. He's the one. It's so peculiar to me that we have this guy that everything points to, so that those who preceded him are called the pre-Socratics. You could say, well, that's just a convention, that they lump them all together. No, I think it's more than that. They precede him and prepare the way for him, and his breakthrough is so extraordinary, given the witness of Plato to it, that we get the Platonic dialogues as an expression of it, that the event is, you hardly know what to say about it. I thought, why don't you check your own hyperbole regarding Socrates so that you don't make it sound so inflated? No, I don't feel like it. Go for it. There's almost not enough you can say about it, that this happened. And I've gone so far as to compare Socrates to Jesus. So you have a comparable breakthrough. I don't like to elevate or inflate Socrates by virtue of comparing him to Jesus, or deflate and sort of put down Jesus by comparing him to Socrates, but it's terrifically instructive to do it. And anyhow, I know the difference between a Messiah and a Savior, and Socrates was not a Savior. Excuse me, Socrates was not a Messiah, as the Christ connotes, but he was a Savior. And that's what started me on the path to comparing them as the two major breakthroughs in the respective cultures and the consequence that follows from each of them.
If Socrates saved us, what did he save us from? Because didn't he give us rationality and self-consciousness, which led to reducing nature? And isn't that a bad
So
thing?
come on, you guys. What did Socrates save us from? I've told you already.
But isn't that the good life? Because apparently when we have this conscious mind and we're thinking outside of ourselves, we clearly destroy nature and we alienate ourselves from it. Isn't that bad?
Sure.
So...
That's an unfortunate consequence. I mean, we made a point of that last time, that the discovery of inwardness and of the soul, in a way, removes us from nature. We become preoccupied with our inwardness to the disadvantage of our relationship to nature. And it's just a strange moment in the Phaedrus, where a friend of Socrates says, let's go take a walk, out into nature. And Socrates says, well, I don't like going out into nature much. I like staying in the center of the city and conversing with everybody, but he gets them to go out anyhow. But you get that sense that Socrates is a civic figure, and that's to the, playing down of one's relationship to the natural order, or the order of nature. But Socrates was regarded as a savior by 4 philosophical schools. Why? Come on,
The idea that, you have your own, things are not predetermined, we're not beholden to the gods or these things that have already been set in stone. We have our own agency and our own morality, and we're in charge of our own decisions.
Well, it's warming up to, but that's not just it. I mean, it's a specific thing. He was thought of as a savior because he overcame the anxiety of having to die. That's what philosophy is about. So you meditate on death, and you really, in a way, take it upon yourself and overcome the anxiety that comes from it. It's fundamentally the anxiety of non-being, as expressed in death, and one's mortality.
Didn't you say, though, that the fact that Achilles was worried about that he was going to die,
Right.
demonstrates that he was like Socrates, someone that had some rational, introspective thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But you're saying that so that means that fear of death means that you are rational and self-thinking and everything like that. Then you're saying that Socrates saved us from that. Wouldn't by that same notion, you could say he introduced, or that style of thinking introduced that fear?
Yeah,
And did not,
no,
in fact, save us from it?
No, the fear was there, but it's really more than fear. It's a big difference between fear and anxiety.
Okay, anxiety.
See, fear is something that is kind of objective, right, that you are fearful of. Anxiety is free-floating, so it's much more powerful and difficult to deal with. And so the anxiety of having to die, which is to understand one's mortality and one's finitude, the Greeks had that in such a precious way. Well, when I taught this course before, I called it Ephemeral Man, and I made up a reader under that title. And it's one of the central Greek terms, ephemeros, creatures of a day. That's how sensitive they were for it, that they took the day as a kind of reminder of their mortality and having to die. They understood themselves as creatures of a day, and it can be translated as day creatures. And so ephemeral is such a Greek sensibility. So Socrates picks up on that and says that philosophy is meditating on having to die, it's having one foot in the grave, and you overcome the anxiety of your mortality by virtue of that. Now, I'll have people that would come up to me afterward and say, well, I'm not Greek in that way. You can't kind of visit that stuff on me. I'm not anxious about having to die. I accept that. And I get through my day okay. So what's the big deal? Well, I don't know. What do you say to somebody like that? Not much. If the point is, that's your introduction into philosophy. So the love of wisdom is a meditation on your mortality. Yeah.
So I'm curious if Socrates overcame the anxiety of him having to die.
Yeah.
How did that save us? So what I'm thinking of is for instance, when you compare that to Jesus overcame the anxiety of having to die, and
Right.
that was him going on the cross and getting
Yeah.
crucified, the most painful possible way to die.
Exactly.
And what that made people do is think, you know what, maybe this guy who said really smart things had a point, and we should do unto others as we want done to ourselves, and then basically that message, along with some other bad messages, got spread, but that's really his main central theme. And I'm wondering what was Socrates' legacy in that sense.
Well, you do draw a strict contrast between the crucifixion and the way Socrates died among his friends with the hemlock, which simply paralyzes you, numbs you until you expire. so it was the opposite of the agony of the crucifixion. And so that's a big difference. But even so, the serenity that Socrates met his death with became basic to his being considered the image of the wise man. And so his serenity in death was a big message sent throughout the ancient world, right on through. So that's one contrast. Socrates didn't do any miracles that I know of. I mean, I can't think of any. He went into a trance state. That's not exactly a miracle, but it's a neat moment in the Platonic dialogues when Socrates goes into a trance, and he's actually on his way into the symposium, and he's picked up his pal, this Aristodemus of Cydathenium. I mean, that's one of the great names of all time, who goes around barefoot. He's known for going barefoot. And he's also known for memorizing everything Socrates says, almost as if he's a kind of a latter-day Homer. So he memorizes everything Socrates says to be able to repeat it. And one of the things he memorizes is think for yourself. So he's almost a figure of fun within the Platonic. That's how playful Plato is. So here Socrates got this disciple and memorizes everything Socrates says, including think for yourself, which obviously he's not doing. And Plato plays with that in various ways, that we don't have time to really go into now, namely how these stories about Socrates get memorized, as Plato puts it, and so that they become the content of the dialogue. There's real funny openers in some of the dialogues where the first line is, "Oh, so that's what you want to know." I mean, who's speaking and who's the you? That's such a strange, and then it goes into, well, okay, we'll tell you because so-and-so memorized what happened, and then he told so-and-so who memorized it too, and then all of a sudden there it goes. And you're getting the dialogue as it has been captured in memory. So,
What about Jesus saying, "Why have you forsaken me?"
yeah,
Compared to Socrates going gently into that good night,
yeah. So you have the disciples in the, especially Gospel of Mark, who consistently misunderstand and don't really get anything Jesus says or what he's about. They're like locked out. It's a device of the gospel, almost as if to blame them for his crucifixion, because they're so obtuse and exhibit such incomprehension. And there are stories after stories that exhibit that. Until finally, the ultimate line is in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus goes off to pray, and the disciples fall asleep, and the authorities come, and then the line comes, and then all his disciples forsook him and fled. And so he's abandoned. Well, Socrates isn't abandoned, except to draw the parallel between Judas, the betrayer, and Alcibiades, the betrayer. So they have the respective betrayers, aside from the theme of abandonment, where in fact his cohorts are all around him when he dies, which is true of Socrates. So, but you have the figures of Alcibiades and Judas that are comparable by virtue of their betrayal of their master. And Alcibiades is a fabulous test case, man. It's just amazing. There are actually two dialogues called Alcibiades 1 and 2 that are not in the Platonic canon as accepted dialogues. They came after, they were written by somebody other than Plato. I don't exactly know why they're outside, but they're marvelous sources for learning about the relationship of Alcibiades and Socrates. And they show up the dynamic of whether you're going to be saved and experience the Socratic Salvation, which in a way is understood as therapy. Namely, you're given health. Your soul is going to be healthy because it's going to come into focus and so on. You're gonna get the right order by virtue of receiving it from Socrates or having him help you give birth to it, which is why he's called the midwife. And Alcibiades tries to seduce Socrates one night. He goes to bed with him and is assuming that he can have sexual intercourse with Socrates, which was a fairly common Greek practice, as we know. And especially pederasty, with guys having sexual relations with younger boys. And somehow it doesn't happen, and they wake up together, and Alcibiades is spiritually seduced. There'd been no genital contact, that point is made clear, but Alcibiades gets it and rejects it. And then becomes the major traitor, not only to Socrates, but also to Athens, by virtue of going over to the enemy. And so the fortunes of Alcibiades, and it's like Alcibiades is kind of one of these figures that's pre-moral. He's like a Don Juan, in the sense that he's not ethically formed. He's pre-ethical. He's so reckless in his behavior and what he does. And he has the chance, in a way, to come into formation and to become an ethical person, and he rejects it and goes off to the enemy. And then the irony, the ultimate irony, is that he becomes one of the bases for the charge against Socrates that he leads people astray. He leads his students astray. That's one of the charges voiced against him. Because of Alcibiades. I mean, they obviously have that in mind, and they're going to blame Socrates for it. So, yeah.
Well, I just had another question. I was just thinking in my head, were there any women present at Socrates' death?
Were they what?
Women?
No.
I was just thinking it's kind of funny that,
He's married. His wife is Antippe, but she's not there.
Well, yeah, I was thinking it's kind of funny that you have women present at Jesus' death, but then no women at Socrates'
so.
death, and you don't have any women in philosophy. But then you have, tons of spiritual and women playing huge roles and
No,
that sort of.
no women, not even his wife. I think I told you that I had a revelatory fit when I turned 50, 30 years ago. And I sat down to my IBM Selectric typewriter, and I wrote out the long-lost last dialogue of Socrates. And I made up the story that he was given some kind of herbal concoction, not hemlock, that would put him into a deep trance state, and his vital signs went down, but he didn't die. But the authorities thought he had. And so they surrendered his body to his disciples, and they squirreled him away, and he revived. And he lived another 2 or 3 years, and this is what he said. And I tried to write out this dialogue where he reviews a lot of things because he's gone through this death experience, which we will detail to some extent at length next time with the myth of Ur at the end of the Republic, where Socrates tells the story of what happens to you after you die and your post-mortal experience before you're reborn to a new birth. So I haven't reviewed a lot of things. I review, what's been said about Homer. He kind of takes on a greater appreciation of Homer. And like that. That was really fun to do. And the only problem is I only wrote about 30 pages and then I let it go. I should have continued it because it would have been fun to have actually written a full dialogue. And I propose that to you guys if you ever get the inspiration, try one. You can do it. And it's an interesting exercise. So the big comparison between Jesus and Socrates is the Logos. And you have John, in the Gospel of John, taking the concept of Logos from Greek philosophy and applying it to the incarnation of the Christ. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And the Logos was made flesh and dwelt among us full of grace and truth. It's kind of hymn to the Logos. And it's translated as word, and you don't get it at all, because it means way more than a word. It's the rational structure of reality. Is incarnated in a person, in a human being. With Socrates, it's the rational structure of reality understood as philosophy that's incarnated in a human being. And that's, that's one of the great aspects or things you can say about Socrates. It's not what he teaches, it's not his words, it's not his example, it's who he is. So the being of Socrates is what's at stake, just as the being of Jesus as the Christ is what is at stake. It's not his words either, or his deeds, or whatever. It's his being. And you get St. Paul talking about the being of the Christ in a way that Plato would like you to understand the being of Socrates as the personification and incarnation of philosophy. I mean, it's made manifest in this figure. And so the eventuality, the fact that there are these major events, you almost have to talk about them as an event more than simply this historic person that appears in either case. They're so eventful that they generate this response. The disciples and the gospel writers in the case of Jesus, and Plato with respect to Socrates. And there are other witnesses to Socrates. There's Xenophon, who wrote his memorabilia about Socrates, but he's a kind of flat take on it, has a flat take, makes Socrates an ethical teacher and so on. And there's none of this manifestation of something mysterious, as if the depth of reason and the depth of being has become manifest in this figure. You get that from Plato. I mean, it's you can't take it. It's so powerful when it finally comes through to you. And you have Aristophanes ridiculing Socrates in a way, being humorous and playful with him in his play The Clouds, where he's Socrates sitting up in a basket attached to the ceiling that's called a think tank, and so on. So you have those three attributions, or sources for thinking about Socrates, but Plato's the key, for sure. Plato has a letter known as the Seventh Epistle. He wrote a number of letters that are extant. The Seventh Epistle is questionable, but I don't care. I like what it says, so I take it as valid, as a letter of Plato. And in it, it's just remarkable what he says. He says there's this book that somebody put together of what I'm supposed to teach and what I believe. And don't pay any attention to it. I mean, you can't encapsulate, like what Plato thought or what Plato said. Forget about it. There's no handbook that can encompass what I am trying to give expression to. If you really want to know how it happens, is that you have to spend time in association with a master, with a philosopher, like Socrates, and slowly, when the time comes, a spark will leap from your master to you and ignite in you philosophy. And that's such a nice way to put it. That's the transmission of the philosophical spirit in this ignition of a spark. And it then turns into a blaze. So it's a lovely expression of the notion in this Seventh Epistle. So, what else? So, the upshot of Jesus is the foundation of the Christian church, and the counterpart is the Platonic Academy, which is the school that carries on the tradition and lasts for 1,000 years before it's closed by Justinian. And then it reappears 1,000 years later in the Renaissance, when Cosimo de' Medici is persuaded to reestablish the Platonic Academy to celebrate the Renaissance as the rebirth of ancient culture in Renaissance Europe. It's one of my favorite stories. I told it to you before. This guy comes from Byzantium. His name is George Gemistius. And he's taken the nickname Plato, which is spelled P-L-E-T-H-O. And he means Plato. But he's too modest to spell it P-L-A-T-O. So he gives it a little twist to express his modesty, even though it sounds like Plato when you pronounce it. I mean, is that weird or what? And so he comes to Florence for the Council of Constance at the time of the Medicis, and he brings with him texts that the West didn't know because they hadn't been transmitted through. They went around through Byzantium. And so he says to Cosimo de' Medici, why don't you reestablish the Platonic Academy, and they'll translate these texts into Latin, and it'll be the rebirth of ancient culture. And Cosimo says, okay, I got an extra villa, let's do it. And he hires Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino, and they're the great translators. And so you get the full corpus of the Platonic dialogues, as well as so many other texts that up till then had been unknown, entering into the Western culture to form the Renaissance. What a nice story. I love that story. And it is coincident to the invention of printing, the new technology at that time. And you have one of the great presses, the Aline Press, run by Aldus Manutius, who then puts out the Platonic dialogues like paperbacks for public consumption. So, that's terrific. And I just want to mention that when I was here, I got a Regents professorship from my friend Jack Stauffacher, who runs the Greenwood Press in San Francisco. He's now 95 years old. And he started the Cowell Press here at Cowell in the tradition of Aldus Manutius. I mean, he's the fine printer, did hand-set work, and the history of the Cowell Press here at this college is the most distinguished history in training students in fine press work. And I might just say, if any of you have any extra time or want to take a class, they offer classes in it, right?
Gary Young does.
Yep.
The problem is that we can only allow 12 students per class because of the fire regulations, and that makes sense, to keep it safe in there. And he's got a waiting list that is,
Oh, he does?
is on.
But the history's awesome.
The history
Because
is awesome.
you've trained so many students in fine press work, many of which who have in turn started their own presses, some of which are here in Santa Cruz
No kidding.
as an ongoing career. And, that's part of the whole tradition that we're sadly seeing eclipsed now by the electronic world. But it's a glorious tradition, and fine press work is something that people cherish and so on. I'll bring a copy of Plato's Phaedrus, a wonderful dialogue that Jack Stauffacher did and dedicated to me in my vision of the Platonic Academy. And it's his handset version of Plato's Phaedrus. So it's a beautiful book. And then I wrote a piece for the so-called supplement that he added to the text on the wings of Tumos, which I've asked you to read, which is online and on my website, ecotopia.org. So if you have a chance, read that, if you haven't so far, for next time. Because we'll make more of Tumos as the centered self, so that you know that you've got a soul when you do the thymus thump. I asked students last week if they had a soul, and they all went, no. If the word soul meant anything to them. And these two ladies here today said yes, so they're an exception. But the rest of the class last time said, no, any more than spirit. Spirit doesn't mean any more to them than soul does. So I was discouraged because I made something of this center, even in Homer, with the word tumos, which is associated with the thymus gland, and that this should be the restoration of an understanding of the soul, because, or spirit, because it makes it, you know, bodily. It's not this amorphous smoke that soul and spirit seem to imply, but it's right here, and it's associated with the thymus gland as its etymological basis. So I'm so keen that you don't leave this class without realizing that you have a soul, and it's here in this middle realm. This is the region of the thymic field, which is your attunement to things, and we'll go into it to some extent because Plato makes so much of it. It's the center of courage. It's the center for your vital self-affirmation. And there it is up on the board, and the dynamic of it is expressed with eros and ate. And eros is the unreflective striving toward what is noble. That's the whole dynamic of self-transcendence that Plato was so keen about informing you and leading you into as you move from desire to pursuing the true, the good, and the beautiful, the good overall, the agathon. And so you got to catch this drive toward transcendence that comes into such expression with Plato, and that you've got to get some sense for if you're going to understand the Platonic dimension of ideas and essences, namely the forms that transcend sense experience and what's here below.
Can you say eros one more time?
Huh?
Eros.
The unreflective striving toward what is noble, which is the dynamic of self-transcendence, toward the true, the good, and the beautiful, the highest expressions in the Platonic realm. In the Middle Ages, they're called the transcendentalia. Ooh, that's a nice term. No kidding. The transcendentalia. Help yourself. There's enough to go around. So I thought I'd try to give you a sense for the two realms in Plato, the realm of essence and the realm of existence, by telling you about the two realms in the creation account in the book of Genesis.
Wait, could you give like an example of eros?
Huh?
Could you give like an example of eros really quickly?
Okay, example of what?
Of transcendentalia?
Yeah, it's the true, the good, and the beautiful. So they're the ultimate forms. And they were called the transcendentalia in the Middle Ages.
So like, for some reason I'm thinking that as like a transcendentalia between two peoples when they reach a very good understanding on something maybe that they've been like struggling to get the other one to get their point across for a long time or something along those lines. That's like kind of what you mean?
Yeah, they're like the forms of perfection.
Okay.
And once you intuit them, or at least rise to them, you experience blessedness. And that's the ultimate aim in Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle more so in terms of using that concept, which is oidaimonia. So you move from the daemon of Socrates, which is peculiar to him, which is, you know, you could say it's an invention of Plato to talk about what made Socrates so unique and peculiar. That he had this inner voice that always told him when he shouldn't do something. So, okay, call it his conscience. Namely, don't do that. It never instructed him on what he should do. It only cautioned him. It intervened, no. It was a no. And in a way you could say that one of the aspects of tumos is the ability to say no. You know the book by Fukuyama, The End of History? That had a big splash about 10 years ago. And he talks about Tumos in that book, because he had been a classic scholar. Now he's a political scientist. And he makes much of Tumos, which startled me, but then I found out he was a classic scholar. And he adds this theme to the meaning of Tumos, namely the ability to say no, which is an expression of your courage. And that's critical to the Socratic understanding. Namely, you are willing to assume the penalty for saying no to injustice. It's what Gandhi made of Satyagraha. I think I even told you that before. The willingness to accept the penalty for, in Gandhi's case, not participating in evil. So if you don't participate in evil, you're willing to pay the penalty for it. With Socrates, it was a matter of saying that it's better to suffer than to do injustice. Which is to say no and then to accept the penalty for it if it's a case of you're doing anything that's unjust. Because Socrates saw it as injuring your soul to perform injustices. Now, does that get anywhere with you guys? I mean, I thought of the Nazis, for instance. Is it plausible for you to think that the Nazis distorted and undermined and, in a way, perjured their soul by virtue of the behavior that they did? So there was, they had to really accept the consequences of their behavior rather than simply perform it and get away with it.
We don't believe in souls.
Huh?
None of us believe in souls, remember?
Yeah, right. I mean, my teacher Tillich gave about 150 radio addresses to the German nation. He was a German emigre. He was one of the first guys that had to get out of Germany because he gave a talk the weekend before Hitler was named Reichschancellor. And the talk was denouncing Heil Hitler because it was demonic. Because the word Heil in German means salvation. And so you were, honoring the saving Führer who was bringing salvation, the one who was bringing salvation. And Tillich said, no way, man. That's idolatry. It's demonic. Forget about it. It's doing something terrible. And then the next day, Hitler became head of the state, and so Tillich had to pack up and get out. So he was one of the first that fled. He took up a position of teaching in New York, and from there he did 150 radio addresses to the German nation during the Second World War. And the main theme of the addresses are, you've got to understand that what you're doing to the Jews, you're doing to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you're that's the thing.
Goebbels said something about in extreme times it takes extreme actions, something like that. That they were in it and they were going to finish it up,
Yeah.
whatever it was. So
Right.
they knew maybe that they were going to lose a war and everything else, but they had to do it. That's what he said. Something like that.
Kind of like Cheney.
Like what?
Cheney.
Cheney, yeah. And Bush.
And Kissinger.
And Obama.
Well.
Well,
Well,
as reluctant as one is to fault his presidency, he sure, was asking for it.
he assassinated a U.S. citizen. Of course, he's asking for it.
Yeah,
And
he
he signed
could
it
have
every
closed
time.
Guantanamo and he didn't. I got this from Amnesty International yesterday and I put it on. It's a piece of barbed wire, but it's in leather. I thought I'll wear this in dismay over Guantanamo and the whole theme of torture that they tried to, gloss in this various ways. So anyhow, that's a big Platonic theme, that you injure your soul by virtue of taking part in injustice. Now, What's so remarkable about Socrates, and I learned this from Kant, you know, one of the greatest philosophers after Plato, 18th century Germany. And Kant formulates the categorical imperative, which I think is a way of capturing what Socrates has meant for history. Namely, the absolute ethical imperative. That's why it's called categorical. It's unconditional. And he formulates it in two ways. Always treat another person as the person in themselves and not as a means to an end. As an end in themselves and not as a means to an end. Persons as persons. You don't violate the person of another person. And you also should attribute this check to your behavior. What if you universalize it? What if everybody did that? That's the categorical imperative. That you apply that check to yourself. But the second one is the real guts of it. And so I thought, oh, he's talking about Socrates. Socrates is the embodiment and the personification of the categorical imperative. Why? Because of the illustration that Kant gives before he formulates the categorical imperative. He says, think of someone who is on their way to a whorehouse, and they're going to satisfy themselves on a prostitute. And you intercept that person, and you say, you're going to violate the categorical imperative by using this woman for your pleasure. And the guy says, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't help it. I'm under this wave of uncontrollable lust. You know, let me go. And you say, okay, go ahead and do it, but when you come out, we're going to hang you as a consequence. Well, there goes his lust. Yeah, okay? That's the example Kant gives. And then the other example, which I think he actually means for us to attribute to Socrates. He says, now hypothetically, even though one can't imagine that this ever happening, and then he's going like, Socrates, Socrates? Yeah, but just take it hypothetically. You don't have to imagine anybody ever doing that. That somebody would rather sacrifice themselves and give up their life than commit an injustice. And I thought, oh, he means Socrates by that. Because what Socrates did, that I think attracted Plato to him. This is the moment where Plato went, I mean, this could be the guy. This is our savior. Was when Socrates is ordered by relatives of Plato who are part of the tyrants who have taken power in Athens. They want to get Socrates complicit in their regime, and he's a minor official at the time, and they order him to go and arrest an admiral who screwed up some kind of naval combat, naval enterprise. But it's ambiguous and it's not clear, but intention pretty clear, especially to Socrates, that they want him to go and arrest the guy and they're going to put him on trial and probably execute him. And they want Socrates to do this arresting so that they will make him complicit in their regime. And Socrates goes home and doesn't do it. Now, you could say he says no. He doesn't say no. He doesn't say anything. He simply doesn't obey. And that means he puts himself on the line where he could have been arrested and executed for being disobedient. And they let him go. But Plato sees this happen, and it strikes him that there's one man in Athens whose integrity is intact. When it seems clear that everybody has had their integrity undermined because of the plague. So then I thought, okay, I take this example from Kant, and he teases it to you by saying, just hypothetically entertain the fact that a guy would rather die than to do something unjust. So you can apply that to Socrates and his refusal of orders. And what was I gonna say? I lost my train of
The
thought.
plague.
Huh?
The plague.
Oh yeah, the plague. Thank you. So the plague happens at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. It's kind of contemporary with Plato and Socrates, and I've never really made the effort to find out the exact dates and how to coordinate it. I don't care. I just want to make something of it. When you read about the plague in the Peloponnesian history of Thucydides, he makes it clear that something of such an enormous purport happened with the plague that it undermined everybody. Bodies piled up everywhere. And the plague not only affected the body politic, it affected everybody in Athens, in their soul. They became plagued. And in a way, Thucydides uses it as a sort of an expression of the spiritual undermining and malaise of the Peloponnesian War. And Socrates somehow remained free of that, so that his integrity was intact, and it was possible for him to act no, which was tantamount to saying no under the penalty of death. And that's when Plato went, okay, that's my guy. And so Plato becomes a disciple of Socrates and his, in effect, gospel writer. You're going to get the gospel according to Plato. That this figure has appeared, who is this enormous breakthrough, not only with respect to rational self-consciousness, which he exhibits to the max, but also with respect to his moral integrity. So that's a nice moment to know about.
I was just doing something else. Could I propose that the categorical imperative removes people from nature because it makes this concept of personhood that we have more important than our own lives, which is evolutionarily, life in nature is driven by this desire to stay alive and to reproduce.
Don't go.
Don't go.
That's garbled.
It's garble.
Yeah.
Why?
I mean, well, because it's not removing you from anything. It's the notion that the highest actualization you can achieve is to become a person, which makes you a moral figure.
Well,
With respect to nature, not just.
Well, but I completely disagree with that because I think that's just giving humans way too much importance in nature. That's saying we are the pinnacle of
Doesn't sound
nature.
natural, though.
There you go. See?
Moral is unnatural. Almost.
What?
I have a theory that moral is unnatural.
Morals are unnatural?
They very much so
I
are.
don't think any animal that's instinctive thinks like, wait, I should be moral and spare this animal that I'm preying on because it has children. I'm hungry.
Only humans do that.
Myself.
When we watch like documentaries, we always feel bad for the baby deer. Like, oh no, don't eat the baby deer. It's so sad. Whereas wolves will just eat the baby deer. Well, I mean that's true, but like we don't even
Or
see
like
it.
cows,
Hey,
We
Faye,
removed ourselves from it.
they're starting to confirm again what you warned me about. Here we are.
Reproduction
We had a
is our highest
discussion last Saturday at my house,
in nature.
and it was really interesting that
Or
we
no longer
couldn't
in nature.
focus on human
Exactly.
beings. We had to focus on the relationship of humans to animals. Because I was making a thing
Say
of the
that.
self-world correlation. Animals don't have a world, they have an environment, and they were saying, yeah. We want to have more rapport with animals than that. We don't want to elevate ourselves above the animal kingdom, okay? And then the corollary was machines. And they wanted to get into the whole cybernetic thing regarding human beings, rather than thinking about human beings in their own right. And huh?
I'm sorry, what I was just trying to argue is that Peter's point sounded somewhat valid to me. So,
But I heard you disagreeing with Peter, so maybe I,
oh,
Peter.
wait, what
Yes.
did you say?
So maybe,
Okay, but what?
So what
how
I
do you-
heard- oh, I'm gonna feel like an idiot here, but I might be overly simplistic, but it seemed like you were saying, wow, we've got a distinction between humans and animals. Because humans can follow the Kantian way of thinking. They can think that something has consequences, certain consequences are okay, other consequences are not okay. And I heard you saying, Yeah, but, oh yeah, but you said it's unnatural. So, yeah, so that is taking humans out of nature, different than animals. That's what you meant? Okay. You agree with it? Okay.
Well, didn't you mention like the Pacific rituals earlier about like
No.
how defeated animals surrender and their attacker basically backs off because they realize
Yeah,
like,
uh-huh.
you know, there's like a thought process there, and that's in animals. So to
Right.
say that they're
Yeah.
distinctly separate is kind of
So I have sympathy for the animal realm, but it strikes me as really odd that it would come to such expression that you want to diminish the human ability, you know, what it means to be human, the human spirit, and its various expressions in morality, culture, and religion. You know, by virtue of comparing that to the animal realm. I mean,
But there is especially now and then historically also, that the whole culture becomes, they forgot the morals. And nationalism and that type of stuff. So the whole country can be in this sort of fever to do these evil things, and they think it's patriotic.
yeah, you could say reduction to materialism is something that, expresses that. If everything is a matter of a combination of atoms and chemical forces and so on, then what's the big deal? Doesn't matter how you behave. So that's a pervasive notion, especially in science, of reducing things to matter. But I still don't quite get what you're getting at with respect to
I'm
the
just saying-
categorical comparative. See, I think to become a person is the highest actualization of one's potentialities. And that's just the case. So
Right.
the categorical comparative is the way of, kind of expressing that and protecting that.
And its failure results wars, for example, and this mass behavior, where the individual disappears. So there's always the individual in that same mass, but and who don't go for it. So they have made a choice also. Conscientious object.
Yeah.
Well, so I see what you're saying, and I think maybe what I was trying to say earlier is that it's not removing from nature, but I think the categorical imperative is post-nature, in that it's something else that's different, because it's not, the goal of nature has never been to realize your actuality as an entity, whatever organism you are. Or we could just even say that, realize your actuality as an organism. But I think when you do that with categorical imperative, it's more like, takes it a little bit beyond that, I guess, or something. It's not, because it maybe not that it's not nature, but it's just nature's changed. If you're going to say that that's the highest of importance, rather than hereditary success, which is what it used to be.
But why'd you say the first part of what you said? Because when Aristotle talks about the actualization of potentialities, he's thinking of an acorn into an oak. And so everything in nature, as far as its growth is concerned, is the actualization of its potentiality.
Well, yeah, but that potentiality, the reason why it became an oak is so then it could then produce reproductive whatevers and make babies, and then it could have more babies, and then its babies could grow up into an oak and make more babies and
Okay,
pass along its...
but still the sequence from acorn to oak is the process of actualizing potentiality. So when you apply it to a human being, you say, well, what are the potentialities that you want to actualize as a human being? And I'm saying to become a person.
Well, I disagree with you, because I think that when you say acorn to oak, that's a physical transformation, where I think in humans, I don't think an adult is the actualization of human. I think that a conscious-minded individual is the actualization of a human. So for instance, if you had a 5-year-old who was completely conscious-minded and had every sense of actuality, I would say that that's a person and that he's achieved personhood. But what I'm saying is I think that in maybe humans it's taken a little bit beyond just the physical transformation into what you're supposed to be. Because now we have this.
But that's our whole point of talking about the spirit, the spirituality,
Mhm.
which is the basis for cultural expression, which is understood as morality, religion, and culture. Those are expressions of the human spirit. So you have to have spirit coming into its actualization in order to have those three forms as a consequence of the spiritual development of a human being.
Yeah, but I just think in terms of natural life, when it comes to natural life, whether we are good to each other or not does not matter. It matters only to human beings. Where in terms of natural life, our actual reproductive success is what really matters, because that's what will influence how life is in the future.
Yeah, as I see it, I think maybe the human spirit could have perhaps been derived from nature, but I think there's, with conscience, there's something a bit more different about it. There's another train of thought.
So I'm trying to overcome this Darwinian reduction that you just gave expression to by virtue of the self-transcendence of the human spirit as it's given expression to in figures like Socrates and Plato. I mean, they're trying to lead you up into the true, the good, and the beautiful as the highest actualization of the human spirit. And that's way beyond reproductive success.
Well, but I'm wondering, why does that matter though? Why does like this transcendence matter?
See, because matter is all that matters. That's what I hear in the background of your saying that.
No,
So
okay.
If you're stuck with matter, it doesn't matter.
But I mean, okay, when I say why does it matter, I mean, does it matter to anything else other than humans?
Why should it? Why? I'm not saying that's
So
what it
then why
matters.
shouldn't it?
Can I talk to
What
Peter?
if that transcendence is an extent of natural evolution?
Okay, but beyond evolution, I mean, like, really, though, why shouldn't it matter to everything else? We're not the only people on the planet.
We are the only people.
Wait,
Or we're not the only things on the planet that are living.
we're not the only sentient.
Well,
We're not the only life, you could say. And isn't what life what matters?
We're talking about human beings, though. We're not talking about butterflies.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think that with that view, if you're going to focus on what matters for humans, then I think it's very easy to just sort of push everything else to the side. Which is what we can't do on our planet, because then when that happens, then
Now, what does he mean by push everything else aside? I mean, why is that a worry here if we're focusing on what it means to be human? I'm not pushing anything else aside.
But I'm saying if the ultimate thing is to be a human, then why shouldn't everything just be a human?
No.
Why is there any life that isn't
Because
human? Why did it matter?
there are various forms of
Because they're
life.
failures.
Huh?
They're failures.
You could say that everything other than human mourns that they're not a human, like my dog. I think something sad about my dog because he'd really like to be a human being.
Well, would he though?
And he touches on it, but there's some sadness about realms of life lower than us. You don't want to use that term either, huh? You don't want to see anything lower than the human being. You don't see the human being as the achievement of evolution.
Well, no, I just think that human being is a step in evolution.
What's the next step?
Didn't
Machines.
I don't know.
Didn't Einstein say that the thing that'll make us least natural is trying to be so? He said something like that.
Think that will what? Say it again?
The thing that will make us least natural is striving to be so. Striving to be natural will make us unnatural.
So Peter,
Hmm.
I may be having like a 2-year-old understanding of what you're saying and what Paul's saying, but is it relevant, would it be a concern of yours, the following question? Is rational self-consciousness good or bad or neutral? Is that something that you're getting at?
I guess, yeah. I mean, I think it's good. I don't think that's not something I'm worried about. I just meant whether it matters in terms of the greater sense
The
of.
bottom line.
I'm sorry, I'll use a different word. Whether it affects anything else other than humans.
Well, yeah.
Well,
Unless only if I mean I guess if we choose to use it to affect other things.
so where I stumble in what you're saying is that I can know that things affect me,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a certain fact that within 50 years,
Mm-hmm.
I will not exist. So has anything let's say I've had the most creative life, I've had the greatest thoughts, I've had wonderful insights, I've written beautiful articles, and then I'm dead. So did it come to anything?
Do you believe in an afterlife?
Let's say I don't.
All right, so I think
I guess nothing really matters then.
no, but I mean you'll leave a legacy though, you know? Isn't that what matters?
But let's say I leave a legacy for my children and my grandchildren,
Mm-hmm.
and then they live to be 110, each one of them, but they don't live to be 120, and then they're gone.
Where they don't live. Say it again. They don't what?
They live to be 110, but they don't live to be 120. Or my great-grandmother was alive. She is no longer alive.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother's no longer alive. My mother's no longer alive.
Yeah.
Okay, these people, I could remember my mother. I can distantly remember my grandmother. I never met my great-grandmother. I could hear stories about her.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe right now.
Well, you're here though. That's why she's
Yeah,
important.
You're like the legacy of your mother and of your grandmother. And so then when when you're gone, you'll be the legacy of your children, and when they're gone, they'll be the legacy of their children. And
Their
that's-
children are your legacy
that'll
too,
be
yeah.
kind of your
So-
descendant legacy as well.
So what? So what? So what? So it keeps going on and on and on until it doesn't, right?
Well, and then humans are gone, or your line is
Could
gone.
be. Could be we're poisoning the earth. Could be that we're going to be gone.
Well, what
Yeah,
you
so what you're getting at is just the destruction of life in total, though. I feel like.
But there's no way to destroy life in total. Like, even if we destroy the surface that is current now, something's going to be there and something will persevere on this planet.
Elsewhere in
But
the
that's such a
universe.
thing.
And elsewhere in the universe, too.
Is this
Maybe
connected
it's
at
not.
all to cosmic guilt? Can you go over that again? I don't know. I just was looking through my notes and
What
saw
did you say? Cosmic guilt?
cosmic
Guilt. That, relating to the saying of Anaximander, where he talks about everything comes out of the source, and then by virtue of its individuation, it has to pay a penalty before it returns back. So there's some suggestion of cosmic guilt by virtue of being individualized. But how does that relate to what we're talking about?
I don't know. I was just asking if it was related. I'm
What was
so
the
confused right now.
penalty for
I mean, he should be cosmically guilty for the views that he's expressing here. Because it seems like all that matters is genetic success. Yes, sir.
No, can I answer this? You guys are seem to having an existential crisis. You don't know why humans exist. Can I answer in a way that reflects my upbringing with The Matrix and Star Trek?
Okay.
Well, humans are a virus. We're only happy when we're expanding and growing, and we need to go to space to do that. And once we do, we don't have to die when our sun dies. We don't have to die when our galaxy dies. We don't have to die when the universe dies. We can make our own rules. We can be eternal. We can be the universal constant. There's no reason why humanity can't do everything.
Mars!
Oy vey. Yes, sir?
If, are our bodies the expression of our soul?
No,
No?
no way, dude.
No?
Yeah. They're just the vessel that we inhabit.
So it has no bearing on our physiological form, though.
Like, I
Why
mean,
would
like,
it?
cause like, what if there's like this guy who has the most beautiful soul, but he happened to get into a terrible airplane accident, and he's like completely disfigured. And so you look at this guy, and he's obviously.
But that's
he knows
looks.
that.
Now, that's just superficial, though. I'm not talking about whether you're beautiful or ugly as a rat's ass. I'm talking about our physical form, being a human, being a dog. Do they, just the fact that you exist in that present form, does that dictate your soul or the type of soul, or even that you have a soul?
I suppose it is
So-
brief.
An old Jewish question is, where is your soul before it enters your body, and where is your soul after it's left your body?
Yeah. That's the Greek issue. So the Greek issue is that your body's a prison, and your soul is imprisoned in it, and when you die, it's released. And that's a big Greek theme. And even though you have the, complete adoration and affirmation of the human body as expressed in Greek sculpting, which has never been superseded, I mean, it's as glorious and a manifestation of the beauty and perfection of the human body, they still carried this theme of the body as the prison. Because your soul has fallen into it and it's longing to get out, which happens at death.
You might hate this, but would you say the soul is something that kind of determines what you are, but you still have free choice? Then the soul would just be genetics.
Say that again?
The soul would be genetics. It determines what you are, but you still have free choice.
Ooh, free will. Go for it, Paul.
No, but this is what we'll take up in detail next week with the myth of Ur. I mean, that's the myth of the fate of the soul after death, and what happens to you when you die, and the period of punishment or reward, which lasts 1,000 years, depending on what kind of life you live. And everybody comes back from that 1,000-year period to gather in a central area before the center of the universe, where the Greek goddess Fate is seated, Ananke, and her 3 daughters, past, present, and future, are seated before her, and they turn the spindles of the universe that are on the lap of the great goddess Ananke, and there you decide what kind of life you're going to live as you're reborn. And what I'll do is try to describe how that relates to what it means to encounter Socrates, who puts you before the decision that you have to make about yourself. And so, I can't give up the notion that we're dealing with material that gives expression to the dynamics of human self-transcendence, which is the glory of this stuff. I mean, that's what the Greeks were after. They wanted to understand what it means to transcend oneself, and that you're reaching for what is ultimate, and especially of ultimate seriousness, and that's the nature of your life and the decision you make about it. And so what I'd like you to do is review the Republic as the assignment for next time. It's the greatest dialogue of Plato, and it's the basis for, just constant return to study. So it's basic for political theory, and it gives the Platonic constitution of rational self-consciousness, which I put on the board. And so you start out with the Republic with the theme of descent. The Greek word is katabane, K-A-T-E-B-E-N. And the opening words are, I went down to the Piraeus, where we witnessed a festival to the goddess Bendis, who is the goddess of the underworld, etc., etc., etc. And we'll carry through that a little bit, but pay attention to the theme of descent and ascent. Then you have the parable of the cave in the middle of the dialogue, which is one of the greatest parables ever written and a subject of continuous study. And that's the parable of the dynamics of self-transcendence. And then the myth of Ur at the end of the Republic, which is again a myth of descent to the underworld to see what happens to souls after they die, and the ascent into the new life. So we'll pick up these themes there, and I'm going to try to do what I can to give you a sense for self-transcendence, how you go beyond yourselves toward, what Plato would call the true, the good, and the beautiful, and get over this reductionist bullshit about life as a matter of genetic success. What's the matter with you guys?
It's not going to space.
Huh?
It's not going to space and getting off this planet. That's what our lives should be dedicated towards.
Oh, man,
Earth is just a
I'll be the first to say goodbye, Alex.
Oh, I won't be one of those pioneers. I will probably be dead by the time we see true space
Yeah, but that's got nothing to do with what I'm talking about.
That's everything. It has everything to do with
Nothing.
it. It has everything.
No, it doesn't figure in at all.
Self-consciousness and rationalization led us to expand across the entire planet, and it is only natural that we move out into space and stars and expand and become a human empire, united under one state, under one government, under one banner, and embrace whatever
Why
gods
is
there
that
are.
natural just because we have rational self-thought? Putting two to two together, I don't understand why that's the destiny. of-
Empires have always existed, as far as the human race is concerned, and it should be.
Yeah, but it's so beyond what we're concerned with here in this class, and it takes things so out of focus as far as the Greeks are concerned, that I'd like to bring everybody back to what we're about, and forget about outer space, and space travel, and whatever nutso vision you have.
I will not let go of my dreams.
Go ahead, I mean, but it's got nothing to do with this class. I mean, nothing.
I will present it.
So I am not gonna be able to be here next week.
Uh-oh.
I know, which is why I brought cookies today.
Thank you so much for that contribution.
But, so give me a little taste of what you guys are gonna be doing in your big wrap-up next week. What are you gonna be, where are you taking it, Paul?
Well, like I said, I mean, to these three major passages in Plato's Republic, which is about human self-transcendence and the difference between, ascent and descent, how it's symbolized by Plato, how Plato uses mythical symbols to try to describe the dynamics of the soul as he hopes to see it constituted. And, I can see already that it's not gonna work. Because the conversation is so split off from the substance at hand that I don't know how to communicate to these guys, especially him. It just like falls on deaf ears.
Understand what the
What?
the issue is that makes like genetics the opponent of the soul, right? Why the soul can't just come from genetics itself, or genes, like little genes, DNA being a capsule of the soul.
There's a soul chromosome?
I
What
mean,
he's saying is that all genetics might be what we can't figure out. We haven't wrapped our head around genetics, so we invented the soul.
yeah, I mean that could be it.
I mean, that's what all reductionists think. We think that anything spiritual is, you just don't understand the physical.
Yeah.
Which is why it's so easy to resist your teachings,
Mhm.
because we already know how to, we've been taught how to.
Right.
It makes it hard for you.
Yeah, totally. And it only confirms what Faye warned me about, that I wouldn't have much rapport with this generation of students because it's 46 years later. And that's been confirmed at almost every turn, that there is no substantial agreement in advance over what we're gonna talk about and take into account. And that's where I failed as far as providing what I guess I had assumed, and erroneously so. It's all, I can see now, it's erased. I gave you a little bit about that in terms of with the way Heidegger crosses out the word being, and Jung writing a book about the modern man's search for a soul and so on. So I'm fully aware of the fact that it's basically all over, and I still thought that there was enough possible interest in ancient sources to inquire into them, so we had some understanding of what they're about and what the themes are, that it would be profitable to teach a class like this. And Faye warned me that she thought that it probably wouldn't work, and I'm willing to concede that she was right in everything she warned me about.
Well, wait a minute, so what's your definition of it doesn't work? If I were a student in the class, I'd be feeling kind of insulted at that.
Yeah, I'm actually going to agree with her. I have to say, I was raised intensely under two minds between my mother and my father. My father was intensely scientific.
Yeah,
My mother intensely spiritual.
okay,
So I really have both of those in me.
Yeah.
I don't think that I have no capacity to understand what you're talking about. What I was asking before, and it got turned into a huge thing, that I'm sorry that it got turned into, and I actually disagree with Max. I don't think genetics has anything to do with the soul. I think the soul is something completely different, which I believe I have, and I believe every human has. I think that's something that's independent to a person. What I was trying to ask earlier was, why does self-transcendence matter in nature, or in terms of nature?
Well, let's say the outcome of it is to produce a human being. So nature transcends itself by virtue of, bringing human beings on the scene.
So its result is human being, and that's why it's... So are you saying that human beings are therefore more important in nature
Yeah,
than everything else?
Like
Yeah.
the earth was made for us.
there's a higher valuation given to human beings than to sub-forms.
Okay, I
And
completely...
and I tried to do that by the distinction between an environment and a world.
Mm.
Namely, you come up to the animal kingdom as the closest to us, and you say, well, that has an environment but not a world. Because the world implies a centered self in correlation with it, and, the language as we know it as human beings, I thought, yeah, well, animals have language too. I don't get into that.
Mm.
If we can't establish the difference between human beings and animals, I don't know where to go with any of this.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Because that's a drag back, huh?
Yeah.
No, that's entirely correct, and I agree with what you were saying.
Yeah.
I didn't get that last one.
So, here I've come out of 40-year reflection on the trend in science to eliminate everything that has to do with soul or spirit, as well as life. Science is responsible for stripping life of all of its salient qualities in order to get it down to dead matter. And matter is all that matters. And I've tracked that thing step by step from Galileo up to now. Now the game is kind of in a little bit of a turmoil thanks to quantum physics and so on. But I don't think it's enough to really shake the fact that that's been the trend. And I gave you some of the steps along the way just to throw them out to you. And this is all a consequence of starting this organic garden here, which took me back into the meaning of organic nature and its integrity. So I know how the whole thing got squeezed out, and that's why I like returning to the Greeks where it's intact, and you can learn about it and profit from it as far as any understanding you want to have of your own human self-transcendence and the decision you make in your life about yourself. So I'm going to put you in front of that next time, because that's what it means to encounter Socrates as Plato develops the dynamics of it. He's your test. He's the guy. He throws your life in relief in front of you so that you decide about it. And I'll show you how that happens. Okay. It's a promise.
All right, okay. Then I get the report afterwards.
Yeah, we'll let you know if it happens or not.
It'll be in the reviews.
So what I'd like you to do is reenact in your mind, if you would, the myth of Ur, because that's the culmination of the Republic. And think of this metaphor. Think of the myth of Ur as a net thrown back over the dialogue in order to catch up the dynamics of what it means to encounter Socrates and the ultimate concern that you're placed in front of regarding the existential decision that you make about yourself. So it's not just the post-mortal consequence of having lived, it's brought into the here and now because of your encounter with Socrates. Plato throws it into the afterlife to make it project, so he can project it on a kind of screen that's called the afterlife, which is, in a way, a nonsensical combination of words. When you're dead, you're dead. But okay, we can imagine about this afterlife in order to develop the symbolic expression of what's going on here and now.
As if we were all in the cave.
Huh?
As if we were all
Yeah,
in the
as if we were all in the cave. And that's where we are. So we got to figure out how to make the ascent out of the cave in order to experience the vision of being just like Parmenides did. Where we can say is. And it cannot not be. The unconditional affirmation of the meaning of being. That's what's at stake with the Greeks. And it withstands all efforts to undermine it.